Hey, everyone. Well, good morning. Congratulations on getting the clock right and being here on time. We appreciate that. I'm really happy to see people here who I've seen before in forums on this topic because it's so important that we keep the discussion going in our church about what we're doing with our history with respect to racial equity, about what's happening in our broader society, what's happening in our diocese, and keeping the train moving forward with respect to putting life into our faith-driven statement on addressing the legacy of chattel slavery. And today we have a really, really extraordinary opportunity to dig deeply into those issues with Gigi Nelson, who is here from the Diocese of Washington. She is the Education Working Group Chair of the Diocesan Reparations Committee. That committee was established in January of 2023. The Reparations Committee, after a year or two of very hard work by a task force that teed up the issues for the committee, there's two working groups, a policy working group and education working group. And they're putting together an articulation of what our diocese thinks it might want to do, what we think the historic wrongs were, what we think healing and reparation and repair would look like. And it's going to be a big topic. So it's important that St. John's stays informed on it. And Gigi, we're so happy to welcome you. A little bit about you. Gigi is a speaker, a genealogist. She's been a college professor of history with a BA in American history from the University of Alabama in Birmingham, and a historian, a military historian with the Air Force, right? And you actually served in combat zones downrange doing military history. But when she settled here in Washington, she's focused on genealogy as a passion. She established a nonprofit called the Majani Project, which encourages young Black people to get involved with their genealogy, looking into their roots, understanding their identity. But she's here today in her capacity, her specific capacity of Education Working Group Chair of the Diocesan Reparations Committee. I invited her because she spoke to the Diocesan Council, and I guess it's some months ago now, and just did an outstanding presentation that gave me a much better grasp of what is actually going on in our diocese and the issues that we really need to think about as a parish as we go forward with this work. So with that, I'm going to introduce Gigi to make some remarks, and then maybe she and I will have a little conversation, but it's a nice, small, intimate group today. Let's get into some real discussion. So thank you so much. Welcome, Gigi.
Thank you so much, Reverend Durst. Good morning, St. John's. I hope you guys can hear me. I can speak up if I need to. Is this good? Okay, well, it's so good to be with you today. Thank you again for inviting me and to speak at your adult forum as part of your racial justice and equity programming. And thank you to Lisa and Mark for making it all happen. I appreciate that. They gave me a lot of stuff to read and I printed all of it out and read all of it thoroughly because that's just who I am. But it was so great to see the work that you all are doing and the effort that you're putting into racial equity and justice issues. You don't need me to tell you that race is the most explosive issue in American life precisely because it forces us to confront the tragic facts of poverty and paranoia, despair and distrust. In short, a candid examination of race matters takes us to the core of American democracy. A candid examination of race, well, that's not asking too much. We'll just get right on that, right? But how do we have a candid conversation around race when we've spent all of the past generations congratulating ourselves on how colorblind we are? How do we talk about America's racial past when we can't even agree on what slavery was or wasn't, or depending on where you come from, who or what ended it? Bringing race up now in the roaring 20s, you see what I did there? Okay, but bringing race up now generally leads to conflict, controversy at worst, or deafening silence at best. So then let's talk about equity instead. I think I may have just heard a collective sigh of relief because that's easier, right? There's a quote by Lilla Watson that says, if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. If you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. That quote captures the essence of equity and justice, that it is our collective work toward liberation. As followers of Jesus, we also have the call given to us by God and our faith to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. And I think I saw that somewhere on y'all's website or one of these things that you guys made me read. Equity is a creative process wherein we are intentionally, consistently, and systematically creating the conditions for all people, particularly those who are structurally and historically marginalized, to experience holistic liberation. Equitable practices fundamentally understand and provide the material supports, transform systems and institutions, community justice, and more than historically marginalized people need according to their particular cultures, histories, traditions, and needs. Change begins with understanding, and that is where the Diocesan Committee on Reparations comes in. So my scripture references for today are from the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. 2 Corinthians 5:18 says, "All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ, has given us the ministry of reconciliation." So this verse tells us that God gave each of us a ministry of reconciliation. And as far as I know, it's the only ministry that God gave to each and every person that calls themselves a Christian. He calls us to love, which should not be optional, but he gave us the ability to reconcile. And then the last one is Matthew 5:24, the part of the verse where it says, "Leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift." And so God is telling us that he wants his children to be reconciled to each other. This is so important to God that he'd rather you postpone your worship or we postpone our worship of him to make things right. And that is a really powerful concept. Reparations is a piece of reconciliation. We engage in reparations for the sake of reconciliation. And I know that there's a lot of debate around using the word reparations, and I get it. I had the same questions, but what I've come to understand is that when you change the language, you are erasing people's lived experiences and denying our shared humanity. The word reparations reminds us that harms have been done. So Bishop Marianne asked me if I would be the chair of the Education Working Group of the Diocesan Committee on Reparations. That's the official name of it. And I said, okay. If I'd known then what I know now, I don't know that I, no, kidding, not kidding, kidding. Okay. I come to this work as a lay Episcopalian with over 30 years as a historian and as a genealogist. And yes, you did hear that right. I know that there's a lot of feeling and a lot of thoughts, a lot of emotion around the direction that the diocese is moving in regarding reparations, but we are all one family. The Episcopal Diocese of Washington is one family. So I want to speak really plainly to you and to our family online as family. Critical examination can be a hard thing, and it can come as a shock to liberal and progressive white institutions. And let's be real, the Episcopal Diocese or the Episcopal Church and this diocese are more or less white, liberal, and progressive institutions. I read somewhere that as a country, we're really good about celebrating the good parts of our history because that's the fun part, right? The festivals, the parades, honoring people that we love. But we get a lot quieter when it's time for a deeper self-examination and analysis, kind of just crickets. And the modern history that we as a church like to point back to is that EDOW stood with their Black brothers and sisters in the civil rights movement. And that's not revisionist history, that did happen. Martin Luther King Jr. preached his last sermon at National Cathedral in 1968. So yes, the diocese has been an ally at certain points, and we absolutely acknowledge that. But this is 2024, and this is where we find ourselves right now in the wake of everything that's happened in the last several years, grappling with the question of how EDOW has been complicit in or has benefited from the legacy of slavery in Maryland and in DC. Critically examining the legacy of white supremacy, institutional racism, anti-Black bias, and a host of other things that make a lot of white people uncomfortable and defensive at best, and completely shut down at worst. And in a parish like St. John's, where you have really a disparate congregation of different kinds of people, it can be harder to acknowledge deep-seated, deep-rooted historical problems. I mean, look around, everybody loves each other and everybody gets along, right? And no one here sees color. For the white people here, I'm sure it can feel sometimes like a real slap in the face to broach the issue of race and reparations. And some of you probably prided yourselves on doing your best to make this place welcoming to everyone. And you've probably succeeded. This is my first time here, but I feel welcome. So, and you should be proud of yourselves because that's what Christ asked us to do, right? To welcome the stranger. But for some Black members, it can feel like we're moving backwards when we're talking about raking up old wounds in terms of reparations, or even worse, that we're handing or asking for a handout from white people. If you are of African or Caribbean descent, you may be secretly or not so secretly rolling your eyes because your experience as a Black person in this country is different from those of Native African Americans, meaning Black people that are born in this country. So if you don't really understand the particulars of our history and the impact of the legacy of slavery as it manifested itself in this country, it's going to be harder for you to really understand where all this is coming from. Our stories as Afro-descendant people are similar, but they are not the same. So I get that there's a lot of conflicting emotion around this. Some of people may be completely against reparations in any form. Some people are fine as long as it does not involve money. Some people feel like it should only be about money. Some people are 100% on board with what the diocese is doing, others not so much. And it's not just, it's every parish, it's individual people in each parish. So I never assume that everybody in one parish is on board with anything that the diocese is doing, because that would just be crazy, right? And we all have a right to our feelings. They're all valid. So I don't want you to think that I'm discounting where we're all coming from. That's why we do these. That's why we come out to places like, St. John's and just start having these conversations so that people can say what they really feel and express their feelings and be heard. And so that, we can take that back when we go and do our meetings and just say, hey, this is what I'm hearing from people, on the ground, basically. So I want to be really clear. I love Episcopalian traditions. I love the rituals, the liturgy in all its forms, high church, low church, I'm here for all of it. I'm not a cradle Episcopalian. This was a conscious choice that I made in 2019. And I'll be a member until I die or until they throw me out, whichever one happens first. So there are so many great things about this diocese, a lot of things that we can be proud of and should be at the diocesan and at the parish level, and especially here. I told you I read all the things that you all are doing, and that's really incredible, and you should be proud of that. And remember what I said earlier, though, that we are a family, and we can't let our pride and our Episcopal heritage blind us to the fact that the family has some fractures, like most families, right? I mean, we don't all love every single one of our relatives, or we may love some a little bit more than others because they're just easier to get along with. Maybe it's just me. Okay. But some open wounds, some harms that as much as we wish they had or like to believe that they have never really healed. And because we've sort of kicked this can down the road and, different things like the whole colorblind movement of saying, we don't see color, we just love the person. My color is a part of who I am. If you are a person of a different ethnicity, that is who you are, right? Like I had a discussion once, I'll never forget it, in grad school. And it was a women's history class, and the class was talking about identity. And they were, the question, I don't remember how it came up, but it was like, are you Black first or are you a woman first? And I was like, I'm Black first, because if I'm wearing, something and you saw me from the back, all you know is that I was Black. And then from the front, you might be able to. So all those things are bound up together and you can't separate those. So that's why I kind of, when you know better, you do better, right? And so it's always a little bit like when I hear people say that they're colorblind, because and I understand where that was coming from. It was an expression of trying to be understanding, and I get that, but we've moved a little bit past that. So that's not really an expression that we use anymore. But anyway, I want to be really clear again that there's been, over time, it seems like it's become much more, I guess, palatable to say sort of quote unquote marginalized people and sort of lump everybody together as marginalized. And this specific issue that the diocese is looking at is about the legacy of slavery and what that legacy has meant both for white people and for Black people, and just how, since the end of the Civil War from 1865 forward, how those sort of paths converged or diverged, right, is probably a more appropriate word to use. And so by just saying marginalized people everywhere and lumping people together as people of color, it sort of buries that the really specific issues around the impact and the legacy of slavery in this country. And this is something that we kind of just have to drag out into the light, right? Sunlight is the best disinfectant, is what somebody told me once. So again, this is not about blame. We're not trying to embarrass or humiliate anyone or say, you did this and you did that, because we've all sinned and come short of the glory, right? If your family or this parish was one of those that did benefit economically from slavery, it was what it was. Our job as the Reparations Committee is to speak truth with love. So that's what we have to do as a family, and just call a thing or a spade, right? So that we can deal with it. White supremacy, racial discrimination, bigotry, systemic injustice. historic Black economic exploitation, reparations. These are not the warm and fuzzy subjects that people just say, I'm going to get up today and talk about these things today because this is just, you know. So we get it, that it's hard and it can be difficult to sort of start having these conversations with people who are different from you, right? And this is why it's probably taken so long to address this issue, because it is difficult and we want it to be meaningful and not just symbolic or performative. That's like that was one of the sort of the key things that sort of motivated me to get involved, is because when they said this is for real, I was like, okay, and then I'm in. So the time is now, not to sit in judgment, but to truly begin to heal as a family. And some of you all may be familiar with the Sankofa bird, right? It's that image of the bird that's looking backwards and there's an egg on its back. And so the whole concept of that is that it's not taboo to go back and fetch what was forgotten. And so in this context, we're sort of going back and examining the heritage and the history of the Episcopal Church and just seeing, you know, those things that were left behind and to get those things back. To know your history and your heritage is to know your current self. That's another concept of the Sankofa. To know your history and your heritage, to know your current self, see the world around you and how to better both, okay? So in this context, in this work of reparations, we're going back and we're uncovering, lifting the veil, you might say, on EDOW's racial past. And that likely runs the gamut from being great to horrific. And, you know, Kathy O'Donnell and others in this parish have done your parish history, so you all know what I'm talking about, right? And in some ways, I recognize that being at this parish is a little bit like preaching to the choir, because you all have done, you know, so much, you know, to really move that needle. And so that's just, it's really amazing. But for our purposes, you could pick a date for when the call for reparations began, from before the Civil War to right after it ended, to 1969, when James Foreman went to the Riverside Church in New York and delivered his Black Manifesto, which made the case that whites should pay reparations for Black enslavement, continuing discrimination and oppression. You may have questioned his methods, but his actions did spark a nationwide reckoning of the larger Christian church's relationship with businesses that were built by slave labor. For our purposes, we'll say 2006, the 75th Episcopal General Convention, when a resolution was passed condemning slavery. And so if you fast forward to 2015, a couple more things happened, and then fast forward to 2017 is when the framework for the Episcopal Church's work toward racial reconciliation, healing, and justice happened. If you recall, the 4 pillars of beloved community: telling the truth about the church and race, proclaiming the dream of beloved community, practicing Jesus's way of healing love, and repairing the breach in society and institutions. So that first one, telling the truth about the church and race, right? So this is sort of where the reparations, I guess, train left the station, if you will. So again, as I said before, when you know better, you do better, right? So with the Episcopal Church's call to tell the truth, the Diocese of Washington took up that work. And our definition of reparations, if you've ever checked out the page on the website, the definition is that reparations is the spiritual and material process to remember, restore, reconcile, and make amends for historical and continuing wrongs against humanity that can never be singularly reducible to monetary terms, but must include a substantial investment and surrender of resources. So Reverend Ann already mentioned that former task force. That was in effect from like 2019 up until 2022 when the new resolution was passed. And they did a lot of work, began to study EDOW through the lens of race. And their work encompassed 2 research initiatives. And then they created a video report. And that video also invited parishes from across the diocese to research their histories and tell their stories. And then concurrent with that reparations task force was the Black Ministries Task Force headed by Reverend Ricardo Shepard. And in 2021, they published a report that contained a lot of similar themes. So you could sort of see that the trajectories were parallel for the most part. And then in 2022, the diocese held that symposium called Repairing the Breach. Some of you all may have been at that. And we came together in person and online to reckon with the diocesan history of participation in anti-Black racism and learn more about the legacy of benefit that the diocese received, particularly from that participation. And then in 23, the diocese passed a resolution that I just mentioned. So EDOW basically took the recommendations from the task force dissolved, and then the new committee was formed. And as Reverend Ann said, the committee has 2 parts. There's an education working group, and then there's a policy working group. And all the names and everything are listed on the website if you're interested in knowing who's on the group. And a lot of the people from the original task force were involved or are involved on the reparations committee now. So the policy working group is led by Reverend Glenna Huber of Epiphany and Erica Gilmore of St. George's, and then there's me for the education working group, okay? So our goal as an education working group is to just help educate the diocese on their history. And part of that is to really encourage parishes to do their history, because you cannot really understand reparations in this context unless you really do your history. And doing history is a lot like doing genealogy. Sometimes you find out really great things and sometimes you find out really terrible things, right? But we have to be brave enough to just be willing to tell the truth, no matter what that truth looks like. Because the truth, people can accept the truth, right? It doesn't have to be sugar-coated, it can just be the truth, and that's okay. So you all have already done your parish history, so I don't have to do the spiel that I normally do about doing parish histories, because that's a pretty good chunk. But since you guys are, Kathy is really on top of that, so I don't have to talk about that. But we can't really even begin to heal unless we address the impact of slavery, white supremacy, and the systemic inequality of the church. So the committee also has some ex officio members. There's the staff from the diocese is Rudy Logan, so he's a part of the committee as well. And so what we've done so far is, and you guys are probably already aware of this, is that the website has been updated and expanded. So now there's a resource page. So there's lots of different tools that you can use if you're interested in sort of learning more about reparations. All the videos that have been done are on there. We have been publishing articles in the newsletter. They started up the social media. So for those of you, I am not really on social media because that feels like a bridge too far for me. but if you are on there, you can follow the Reparations Committee on there. They do postings weekly. So like I said before, I am a genealogist, so I do look at this as a family, and this is really, to me, it's about healing family. And then finally, I think I will just leave it and say that as you continue to do the good work that you're doing, because you guys are doing good work, that I would just encourage you that the way that as you continue to show up in this space, that you're making sure that everything that you do is relational and not transactional. Okay? And that's my presentation.
All right. Well, great. Let's just take a few minutes to chat and then we'll open it up to questions. Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank you again for coming today, and I want to thank everyone who's here today. It's such an important topic, and it's also a topic that's difficult to approach, as you acknowledged. And I appreciate that you talk about it as an issue of family, and that we need to be in a space where we can bring in the light, the sunlight, and look at things good and bad, and have a respectful conversation, despite what may be significant differences of opinion on various issues related to the topic. And you said you were preaching to the choir here, but I can tell you that we have a broad range of opinion in our parish. And our goal has been to be a place, to be a parish where people can feel comfortable and are willing to bring out differences of view. Because it is really important that as we go forward in this work, we reach a common understanding to the extent that we can about what the problem is and what it is that we really want to do. Mm-hmm. And in that regard, I'd like to start with a question about how we talk about these issues, because as we've learned, there are certain words like reparations that are trigger words and that they trigger in all of us certain understandings about what that means. And I personally, based on my experience with my parish, I'm not sure that we have a common understanding of what we mean when we say reparation. And I remember Kelly Brown Douglas did a fantastic article at one point where she said, it's not just about money.
Absolutely.
It's about acknowledgement. It's about spiritual repair. Can you give us a little bit more depth on when you or the diocese are looking at reparations and we say that word? What are we talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. For a lot of people, the first idea that you have when you say the word reparations is, oh, somebody's looking for money, right? But the way that we interpret reparations and what it means for the diocese is really, it encompasses so much more than that. The bishop has made it very clear that there should be a substantial monetary, as I said in the definition that I read out to you. But we're talking about changing culture, because giving money is nice, but it doesn't change what caused that behavior, right? So we're really talking about, for us, it's about a change in culture to where white supremacy, anti-Black bias are no longer sort of the prevalent ways that the diocese operates. And those are so much harder to root out, right? Because nobody wakes up and says, yeah, I'm a white supremacist, because that just sounds like you're a member of the KKK, right? And nobody wants to think that, and nobody is a member of the KKK, I'm sure. But that's what the word white supremacy sort of brings up for people. But the reality, I've been reading over the last couple of days, I got some articles. I don't know if I have enough copies for everybody here, but just about the concept of white supremacy and how it is so fundamentally tied into the American Christian church. And it's so, there's a word that I'm trying to think of and it's escaped me. But it's so fundamental to the way that Christianity has sort of developed in this country. And until you sort of recognize that and can see that, that can be and even when you do recognize it and see it, that can be a very difficult thing to contend with, because it's so baked into American Christianity. It just is. And how that happened, whatever, but that's the way that it is. And you see that when you sort of recognize that, then you can start seeing the patterns of just how different rectors are called where, and who gets what, and what that equity piece looks like at the diocesan level. And so when we're talking about reparations, it's really about making the institution of the diocese as equitable as possible, so that everyone has the same chance, everyone has the same access. And so reparations for the diocese, a huge part of it is about equity and access. And then the monetary part it's on the list, but it certainly isn't like first and foremost. So I hope that helps. And one of the things that I realized that I forgot to mention is that the purpose of the Reparations Committee is to create a policy proposal for convention to vote on
It's
next
so
year.
important that people know what's coming, yes.
Yeah, and I totally forgot to say that.
Me too.
It's the time change. I'm going to blame it on the time change. Anyway, so that's the goal, is to really sort of look at the issues in the diocese and do the work to understand where the harms have been committed. And so that's another piece for the education working group, is to really dig in. And so I got a list of people yesterday that I'm going to follow up with. For example, churches have closed, Black churches have closed, right? And I don't know how many of you were at convention, but Reverend Peter from Calvary, we did a whole deep dive into, the Black and white churches and sort of the, just on like parity terms, right? And so you could see just from like the fact that white churches have endowments, and there's nothing wrong with an endowment, so don't get me wrong. But when you look at where that money came from, the reality is that a lot of it is part of that legacy from slavery. And so we're talking about impact. Those are the kinds of things we're talking about. So fast forward to 2024, and I know I've gone like way off subject here from what you actually asked me.
That's okay.
I'm aware of that. But as in Peter's presentation, he showed how Black members and Black parishes actually give more money annually. But because the church is already sort of started from like down here, it doesn't matter how much money the individual parishioners give. There's rarely enough to do the maintenance and the things that are needed in those churches. Whereas in a lot of the white churches, you've got those endowments, you've got those different levels of funding that you can tap it or not, that people can tap into. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I'm just pointing out the differences, and that's because of that legacy of slavery, if that makes sense. So anyway, our purpose in the committee is to create a proposal for the diocese to vote on in terms of a reparations proposal in January.
And in that connection, what is the diocese doing and going to do to make sure that we bring along all the parishes, that people know what's going on, that they understand what's happening and why, so we don't leave anyone behind? And we really reach a common understanding of
that's the question, right? That's the central question of the whole reparations committee, is how do we make that happen? And so, we anticipate this isn't, the committee was formed for 2 years, right? And we all came to an early understanding that 2 years is not near enough time. The Diocese of New York, it took like 15 for them to come up with their proposal and what they ended up doing. So we recognize that it's going to take a lot more than 2 years. So it's one of those things where, you know, the work is going to continue long after this committee is dissolved. And what that looks like is what the policy working group is working on in terms of, you know, how we move forward once this committee is dissolved.
You mentioned the Diocese of New York, and we know that right here in Maryland, the Diocese of Maryland has been very active on this.
Yeah.
Can you give us a little insight into what other dioceses have been doing?
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, and somebody may know, because I've been just so focused on EDOW that I haven't done like a ton of research in what other dioceses are doing. Other people in our committee have done that, not necessarily me. But if I'm not mistaken, New York, I think they set aside like 14 million, like over 7 years that they're committing to reparations. I know the Diocese of Maryland, is it 1 million or 100,000? I can never remember.
1 million.
Is it 1 million?
Yeah.
Okay,
Mhm.
yeah.
But that's all financial. Are there other
yeah,
things?
that's all. And so there's those are the parts that I'm the most familiar with because that's what I've heard. But I know that other dioceses, actually, the Diocese of Massachusetts, I was on a Zoom call the other day with a guy who was really active in the Diocese of Massachusetts, and they're really working on sort of like the equity piece. And I think they did like set aside a financial piece, and I don't remember what it was, but they're like really focused on really creating that community in terms of, you know, the Black parishes, the white parishes, and not even just the Black parishes, but just the overall Black community where the parishes are located, and just really, you know, doing the work to understand the people. And so I'm happy that they are getting away from like, oh, what can we do? What do you need kind of things, and really focusing more on, let's get to know you. Let's really start having conversations. Like the way you do with, you know, people that you just meet, like, you know, go out for coffee or invite them to your church, you know, and not just invite them to church, but like if you're having a series, like invite them to be part of that, or, you know, ask them if they want to do something at your, you know, just creating those relationships, because that's what changes people, right? Is when you know somebody, when you meet somebody, say, oh, well, Gigi's not so terrible after all. Right? Maybe not. But anyway, but that's the point, is like once you get to know somebody and then you can understand where they're coming from. And if you never get outside your bubble, then you're never going to be able to have that. And it's so enriching when you get to meet other people and get to just know people. It's so much more enriching. So yeah.
Well, I think you kind of anticipated the last question I'll ask before I turn it over to the group. You said at the end of your presentation that make sure that what you do in work going forward is relational and not transactional. Could you just elaborate a little bit on what you mean by relational and well, you just did, and transactional?
Well, I'll take it a step further, because anybody who knows me knows that if I'm thinking it, it'll probably come out of my mouth. But one of the things I told you guys that I'm a new Episcopalian, right? And one of the things I've noticed that the Episcopal Church does, and it's not a bad thing, so do not say that Gigi said this is terrible. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that I've noticed that, and this is true for Black and white parishes, okay? So this is everybody. And I've noticed that we're really good about the whole food pantry concept, right? Like everybody's so proud of their food pantry and they feed all these people. And that's great because people are hungry and people need to eat. But I guess I kind of look at it like, in all the years that you've been doing a food pantry, how many of those people now have a relationship with Christ, whether they go to your church or not? But and to add to that, like how many disciples have you made that do come to your church? So if all you're doing is showing up every Saturday to hand out cans and produce, I mean, what are we really doing, right? So if you're looking at it from a relational standpoint, the focus of that outreach should be to bring people to Christ. And so, you know, it can't just be that transaction of showing up to hand out cans.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to make a pitch for our Nourishing Bethesda, which from the start, it's not that we're recruiting for Christ in sort of the way that some churches do. It's more, we're trying to exhibit how Christ would act in what we do. And we're very conscious about the fact that while we're feeding people, we're also feeding souls of people who want to be involved, who want to give to others, who want to, whether they know it or not, exemplify the way of love in Jesus. And that's an intentional part of our feeding program. Anyway, enough with the advertisement.
Intentionality. I think that's the word, is intentionality, and how that manifests and how that shows up. So, and that's not to say that everyone who has these ministries, that is, they're just showing up and throwing stuff out. I'm not saying that.
No.
But yeah, just the intention of manifesting Christ's love, and then that translating into how those people will go forward or move forward, right?
And I'll just make one comment about a deacon colleague of mine who's a Black woman. And we were talking about this once, and I asked her, what is it that personally would really like out of this conversation? And she said, I just want to hear that you know something wrong was done and that you're sorry. Not you personally, because you did it,
Yeah.
but that you understand the wrong was done. And that was really eye-opening to me. And going back to your point about repairing the breach and Christ's ministry of reconciliation, for me, that's what really underlies this work. But anyway, let's turn it over now to the audience and ask people to please take advantage of this opportunity and this wonderful, safe space, respectful space to raise any questions,
please.
difficult or otherwise, because I know Gigi
Ask me
would be
anything.
happy to answer.
And if anyone who has questions could come over to the mic so that the people on Zoom could hear you.
Right, and we want to invite the people on Zoom to put questions in the chat, Lisa?
Yes,
Is that
yep,
right?
and I have a couple already, so maybe I'll start with that while.
Why
any
don't
of
you throw one or two out?
Yeah, one note was that the Diocese of Virginia in 2021 has committed $10 million and some equity initiatives. But a particular question is, you mentioned the disparity across parishes. And there separately, I think the diocese is doing a number sort of evaluations across parishes where some may need to close. And the question is whether equity is part of that consideration, given that the whole reparations process is on a different timeline.
Honestly, I'm not sure that I know enough about, I know that the diocese is doing those assessments, but I don't know enough about it to really answer that question thoroughly. The little teeny tiny bit that I know is that as the diocese is moving forward with those assessments, that other groups as well are looking at that and providing input into how those things are going to happen. I can say that.
Question?
While he's making his way to the mic, I'll also say, one of the things that we've uncovered as part of the reparations group and our working committee is that, there are churches who are having or may have had to close. And then you learn that, when they first got there, that the building itself was kind of in really bad shape, the building that they were given. And so now they're having to close. And so it's kind of like, the compounding, bad to worse kind of thing. So it's all of those things, you have to kind of look at the history of each of these parishes and see where they came from and where they are now. And so I'm sure that, as the diocese moves forward with their assessments, that all of those things will be taken into consideration. And then, as they move forward with whatever policy that they're going to have on those churches. Yeah.
Right, and I'm looking forward to learning more about the history of the parishes of the diocese, because I didn't realize so many parishes split and became a white
yeah.
parish and a Black
Yeah,
parish.
yeah.
And the white parish got certain assets and the Black parish got other assets.
Yeah. And you
And
have to recognize that the whole reason that there are separate Black and white parishes is because white parishes didn't want Black members, or they wanted them to only worship in the balcony or in the back of the church. And, after a while, people want to be able to do what they want to do, right?
Terry.
Thank you. So Sari Atik, Gigi, thanks so much. I'm just so aware of what it's like being on this committee and having to go to different parishes. And you want to just get out and say reparations is important. It's it's the work of justice and all this, but you have to kind of nuance what you're saying because you want to sell this thing, right? You realize that people are they're in different places in their journey toward that. There might be some people sitting who are not for that at all, right? And so I'm sensitive to what that must be like to have to sell this when you, like many of us, have a really strong feeling that this is necessary and important. And one of the things that you said a little bit a moment ago when you talk about white supremacy, that most of us don't wake up thinking of ourselves as white supremacists, but we are, if you think of the system we live in, And I was thinking of what it's like when I could say like I'm against consumerism and capitalism, but I exist in a society where I'm participating in that all the time. So I have to take responsibility for the fact that like, unless I am not, paying taxes or going shopping to the grocery store or going to buy clothes from this store, unless I'm not doing any of that stuff, I'm making my own stuff and gardening my own food, I am participating in all of that stuff. So I just wanted to lift that. And then I wanted to ask you a question. So we tend to have a check the box mentality oftentimes. Like we authored a statement about racial equity at St. John's, and I'm really proud of it. In some ways it felt like we checked the box, we did it, we're done. And I'm so concerned about like reparations. Oh, okay, we decided we're going to give $10 million to this thing. We did our job. We just corrected the past. And this idea of like a task force versus a standing committee. And I feel like the diocese needs a standing committee that for the rest of our history is focusing to make sure that like we are talking about dismantling racism. And so I just want to hear your thoughts on like the check the box type of mentality and like what do we do as we move forward when people say, look, you guys did your job and we gave money, what more do you want? And of course, like, I hope you're not thinking that's where I'm coming from. I just want to say like, where do we go from here once we're done with this work?
Yeah,
So
and
thank
I mean, you may not be, but somebody else may be. And so that's okay. We are where we are. I want to address first that whole thing about the cell, because you're right. It's a, I guess you could sort of look at it as sort of a tightrope, right? But I guess the way I see it, I believe that only God can change hearts. There is literally nothing that I could say or not say that's going to change anybody's mind about anything. Only God can do that. And so I just, for myself, and I'm sure I think I can say this for the rest of the members on the committee, is that we do our best to just be led by the Spirit in what we say and pray for grace to say, try to say the right thing, at least for me, because sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But I believe that if people are seeking Christ, and it's not to say that I think that everybody's going to believe the exact same thing that I do, but what I do believe is that as people seek Christ, that God reveals himself to them. And so however he reveals themselves to them, then that's how they're going to show up, right? And so I don't worry so much about trying to sell reparations. And there are people who certainly, that is uppermost in their minds. I can't say that it's uppermost in mine, because I believe that's God's job. My job is just to get out there and do the best that I can and do the work that they asked me to do, right? The rest of it, I got to leave up to him. So I believe, but having said that, I believe that you can speak the truth in love. So, you don't necessarily have to say that baby is ugly. But what you can say is, you can just say that's a really nice dress the baby has on, right? Like you could just, I mean, so you know what I mean? So my point is just like, you can speak truth, but you don't have to be aggressive about it. You don't have to be nasty about it.
Absolutely.
Right? You can just say the things that need to be said.
That's speaking truth in love.
Exactly. And just speaking that truth in love and my little sister, I was 16 when my little sister was born, and that child, bless her heart, and and this is when I was a kid, and I used to just say, she'll grow into her face. That's what I used to say about her. And I have a bunch of sisters, so none of them know which one I'm talking about. So, but yeah, because, she was who she was. But so my point is just, you can figure out a way to speak what you need to speak, say the things that you need to say, and not be offensive, because, you don't have to be offensive to speak truth. I think that's the bottom line. So when it comes to the cell, I just kind of put it out there and pray that God will do the rest. And that if I do say something that's like that, he'll, block people's ears for that instant or whatever, that they, focus on something else. But anyway, in terms of the check the box mentality, that is a concern. Absolutely. No one wants this to be symbolic or performative. We want it to mean something. We want it to outlast this committee or the next one if there's another one formed after that. Your discussion about like a standing committee, those are all things that have been discussed. So because we don't want this to just end once this committee is over. So all those things are on the table in terms of how we move this forward, because we expect it may take some time. I mean, even just to do parish histories, if you don't have a parish that's necessarily well equipped with people to do that kind of work, even people who want to do it, but if they don't have a background in research or in methodology, all the things that go into being a historian, and as someone who has a master's in history, like that is really important to me.
We have some historians here.
Right. So you feel me on that, right? You want it to be done right. And so even if you have people who want to do it, but maybe don't know what they're doing, so all this, you're talking about resources to enable people or enable parishes to be able to do a history. And that takes time, right? So this isn't going to be a, super quick, fast thing. So it will take time and it will need to continue. So we're looking at all those things. And so all those things are on the table.
Okay.
Thank you. Hey, Ginny, could you unmute? And then Chris after Ginny?
And then Sharon.
Yep. Sure. Ginny, you're still muted. Could you unmute?
Thank you. Oh. Okay, I'm sorry. A little struggle with the unmute. I'm going to speak about the one thing that I wanted to start off by. I joined St. John's after leaving a historically Black Lutheran church that actually folded after its 100th anniversary because of political divisions that occurred. And I just wanted to say that that's where I'm coming from as a member of this church. But it was in the chat, it was stated how the Virginia Diocese set aside their monies for not just to benefit Black, but to benefit Black, Indigenous, and peoples of color communities. And I wanted to state that I think that that's an important thing that we need. And it goes along with the idea of checking the box, that we need to be focused on our community at large and not just try to work on, okay, let's deal with the Black side of the question and we'll deal with the others later. We need to actually be able to focus across the community at large. Thank you.
Yeah, agreed. I know that the National Church has an Indigenous, I don't know exactly what the name of it is, but I know that they have an Indigenous committee that's working on Native American, I don't want to say affairs, that sounds very bureaucratic.
Right.
But basically, yes, they do have that. I don't know if this diocese does, but I mean, Jenny, you're absolutely right. There's certainly enough harms to go around. And all of them are equally important. There's no doubt about that. I think that the reason that this issue of the legacy of slavery has kind of come to light right now is because of the impact of, the murder of George Floyd and other things that have happened, that sort of confluence, right, of those police brutality issues, the pandemic. It all just kind of merged into this thing where the awareness was just so great that I think it was a catalyst for action within the Christian community. And I'm happy that the diocese has taken that up.
Chris?
Well, I didn't necessarily, thank you. I didn't necessarily have to say anything, but I'll take the opportunity. I put the information out there about Virginia because Virginia is unique, I think, in the world in terms of its role in slavery from the beginning. And so it has an awful lot of baggage. And the fact that they did that was a result of about 10 years worth of work by a handful of clergy, and which became, a couple of handfuls of clergy and then the lay people. So it is a very long process of us, I think, awakening to what's happened awakening to our responsibility to try to figure out how to move forward from it, and then really doing the work, which I think to Sari's point is the hard part. I did some DEI work in major corporate America, and it was a long slog. It took us 10 years to get to the point of one of the leaders saying, this is not a business case, this is a moral case. So we've got to get to that point. So we do have to try to figure out every day, what can we each do? And, what can we try to help leaders do? And I think it's interesting, it may not be exactly related, but the Diocese of Virginia called a bishop last year after a vacancy. And they had the most diverse selection committee, search committee that they've ever had in the Diocese of Virginia. And they ended up with, I think, 3 or 4 candidates, all of whom were white men. And there was a bit of an uproar around that until somebody explained that the change that was needed was so endemic that the only person who could do it was somebody from the inside who could influence the folks who really need to start the process, who were the white men that ran the diocese. So I don't know if they made the right decision, but that sometimes you have to think about what are the practical steps that need to be taken to actually start making the change, and it's difficult.
Yeah, your comments made me think, Chris, about there was a conversation I was having, or I was listening to with some people on the Reparations Committee, and they were talking about, just the leadership structure at the top and what that looks like and what the diversity looks like there, right? And so if you're looking at a slate of people who all kind of look the same or are the same gender or whatever, that should be looked at, and it should be sort of questioned and examined, because you want you want that diversity of expression, so that because people bring different things to the table, right? And so those things are important. And to your point about that person who is kind of has those connections, being able to fix the problem, I think it's valid. Like you said, I don't know if that was the right decision or not, but I can certainly see that point for sure. It's such a huge endemic issue that it's going to take all hands on deck.
Sharon.
Such a pleasure to have you here, Gigi. Thank you. Thank you. I could ask you a million questions, but in the publicity for today's forum, it said you might have some ideas for us on operationalizing our statement on faith-driven statement on slavery and racism. So I'm guessing you said you got lots of materials. That's one of the things you got from us to read.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
It is one of the things.
So I'm imagining that, there's a piece of this for us to look at actually how we run our church, and that can be a bit of a model, for helping us change our thinking about how, basically the country can be run, all different levels of institutions could be run in this country. And so, wondering if, I'm sure you don't have time to get into it very far right now, but if there's any resources that you'd recommend for helping us look at how we run our parish, how we learn from, changes we make internally that we can apply to the broader world. I don't know if there's probably some from other parishes or dioceses or whatever, wondering also if there's anything from non-faith institutions, non-Episcopal institutions, models that we might look at as well. There's a book that some of us are aware of called Wait, Is This Racist by Breonna Taylor. And that really gets into some nuts and bolts, in my opinion. I don't know if you're familiar with that or if it's recommended, but anyway, just recommendations, I guess, is what I'm asking for. Thanks.
Wow. So I would never dare to try to tell you guys anything about how to run I think you're doing a fantastic job. But as far as the resources go, the website has a ton, and you've probably already gone through a lot of those. I think, and this is just me, I'm not going to say that the diocese thinks this, because I don't know what they think, but just what I think is, and this is informed by the things that I've been reading lately. And just if you've been reading, or if you do some reading around just sort of the interconnectedness, or I guess the embedded aspects of white supremacy in Christianity, I think it opens up kind of just a whole nother window. And I look at it as a window of opportunity, because it's a window to sort of, once you know better, then you do better. And That's a tough one. So the short answer is, I don't know that I have any like hard and dry, hard and fast things to sort of help you operationalize living into this, faith-driven, you're talking about the faith-driven response, right?
Yes.
I mean, it was so good. Like it's super comprehensive, and I was really impressed when I read it. So I don't know who wrote it or the committee that wrote it, but all you guys. Yeah, I thought it was really amazing. And keeping that in the forefront of your mind, I mean, I think that does it, you know what I mean? Like when you're reading something over and over, it sort of gets in you, and then that's how you sort of start, that becomes your worldview anyway, right? So I think you guys are on the path and doing great things. So yeah, I don't even really have an answer for that.
Well, I think you gave us an answer when you said, make sure that what you do is relational, not transactional. And that gets back to Sari's point about checking the box. We're not going to write a check for X number of dollars and say we're done,
Yeah.
because that's not it. Because this work is underpinned by the theology of reconciliation and repairing the breach.
Yeah.
And so we have to start by acknowledging that a harm was done, right? And that can be hard for some people. And
Yeah.
so one last question I would like to ask you is, how do you get over that hurdle? Or maybe that's not the biggest hurdle you've encountered in being able to engage people in a discussion about this, but sometimes we get stuck right there. There's no problem in America today with race. I didn't do, my family, I personally was not responsible for that. There was no harm, lasting harm. It's over. We had the Civil War, we had the Civil Rights Movement. It's over. How do we deal with that?
I think it really comes down to being willing to, if you haven't done your family history, start there. That is an extremely important way to just sort of learn about how your particular family intersects with American history, and then where it intersects with people of different ethnicities. When you look at, and again, I'm not saying that this is wrong or bad, this is just the way it is, right? If your family perhaps, had a house in a certain location and then they chose not to sell it to certain people, right? That's an intersection of race that you may or may not be aware of. So as you learn these things, inside your own families, then it becomes that much more real. And then from there, you sort of bring that into the church and look at like, how, and your parish has already done this, but individually, I was reading something that said that, and I realized like I've probably got 2 seconds, so I'll make this
You're
really
doing
short.
fine. Great.
That when it comes to American Christianity, we have a tendency to really look at the concept of personal sin and not collective, like the collective sin. And so for people, especially for white Christians, it's much more about, where I personally may have fallen short. And it's never about like what the greater parish or congregation has done in terms of, how they relate to other people or outside people. So it was just, I'm gonna sit those out and just, I really don't know if I have enough to give to everybody because I gave a bunch out yesterday, but I'm gonna sit them out. And if you want to grab one, feel free, they're yours to take. But just doing your own family history, if you haven't, is a fantastic place to start. And then that idea of it wasn't me or I didn't own slaves. Most people didn't. I mean, that's the reality. In America, most white Americans did not own slaves, which begs the question, then why would people fight in the Civil War when they didn't really have that big of a stake in it? I finally heard a white person say this a couple of weeks ago, and I wish I had recorded it because this was the first time in my entire life I'd heard someone else besides, people that I know say this. It was because of the whole concept, well, I may be poor as dirt, but at least I'm still white. And that was the reality. That was why you had so many poor whites fighting in that Civil War, because of an idea that being white is still better than being Black. And that's the reality. So whether you owned slaves or didn't, there was that privilege that people had. And there's different kinds of privilege, don't get me wrong, but that particular privilege of being white in America was so pervasive and prevalent that people were willing to fight and die for that, to keep those things separate, poor Blacks or, enslaved or whoever versus, a white.
There's a lot of interesting history on how that
Yeah.
concept was actually cultivated.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
maybe in another time we can have that discussion.
Right,
But
yeah.
I would like to thank you for coming today. And I hope that we might tap your knowledge and expertise as we go forward in this
Yeah.
coming year and after
For sure.
on this important subject. But
Definitely.
please join me in thanking you. Thank you. It was wonderful. you have something you want to hand out or leave for us?
Yeah, I'm gonna grab the.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hey, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's just the
Thank you
beginning
for
of it.
inviting me.